Thank you for joining us this evening. You are now attending the webinar entitled Education and Student Formation, Ethics and Profession of Teaching. Education and Student Formation, Ethics and the Profession of Teaching. Our leader for this session is Dr. Edward L. Queen II, Director, Associate Teaching Professor of the D. Abbott Turner Program in Ethics and Servant Leadership at Emory University. I'd also like to acknowledge tonight's TA, Elizabeth Alt, who's from the Shawnee Mission West High School in Overland Park, Kansas. Elizabeth, it is great to see you. I look forward to working with you throughout this year and had a chance to work with you prior to this point. She is a member of our Teacher Advisory Council who serves as TA for tonight's session. All right. Edward L. Queen is Associate Teaching Professor and Director of the D. Abbott Turner Program in Ethics and Servant Leadership at the Emory University Center for Ethics. He also serves as a co-director of Emory's Institute of Human Rights. Previous positions include Founding Director of Religion and Philanthropy Project at the Indiana University Center on Philanthropy and Program Officer at Lilly Endowment Incorporated. He received his BA from Birmingham Southern College, his MA and PhD from the Divinity School of the University of Chicago, and his Juris Doctor from Indiana University School of Law, Indianapolis. While in law school, Queen led an Innocence Project team that freed a wrongly convicted man after 20 years in prison. Between 2000 and 2003, he worked at a human rights organization in Macedonia and served as the faculty and curriculum development consultant for the law faculty of that country's newly founded Southeastern European University. Queen's work focuses on applied and professional ethics and the development and implementation of ethics programs in businesses, nonprofits, and governmental agencies. As a teacher, his goal is the formation of ethically informed and publicly engaged citizens. He is frequently called on by the media to comment on ethical issues in government, nonprofits, law, and business. To our network of teachers, both nationally and internationally. And without further ado, I present to you our scholar and leader for this session, Dr. Edward L. Queen. We are honored to have you with us, Dr. Queen, tonight, and we look forward to hearing your talk. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Mike, and thank all of you for being here. I know for many of you, especially as you move further and further west in the time zones, it's an awkward time, and I appreciate that you made the time to kind of sit and engage with the question of ethics. What does it mean to be an ethical teacher? What does it mean to profess the role of teacher? And I think, as most of you of individuals committed to the humanities, the issues of what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to kind of live out a particular way of being in the world on a day-to-day basis matters, right? And so I think all of you are already somewhat attuned to these questions. And before I begin, I really just want to thank all of you for all of the work you do as teachers. It's a challenging and important role. And my brother just retired as an elementary school principal, and I well know what all that brings. I want to begin really with this kind of comment from Thomas More from Eliot's, well, actually the movie of Eliot's play, Murder in the Cathedral. And Richard Rich in the character has become this kind of lackey in the government, or is tempted to become a lackey. And talking about what he could do instead. And Moore asked him, well, why not be a teacher? You'd be a fine teacher, perhaps a great one. And Rich asked the question, well, if I was, who would know it? And Moore's response is you, your people, pupils, your friends, God. Not a bad public, that, right? So who knows what you're doing and who knows what your commitments and struggles are? Well, your pupils, your friends, if it works for you, God. It's not a bad public. But it is a kind of challenging discipline, right? And so today, as we begin our thinking, as we begin my presentation, there's gonna be three parts really. What does it mean to think better, or to think about ethics within our work as teachers? What does it mean to profess teaching? And what are the ethical obligations that we take on by becoming teachers? And how do we act out, or how do we import the kind of ethical concerns into what we do, into how we practice our profession? And then also the kind of question that I raised differently is the ethics of. And we'll talk about this, but when I talk about the ethics in teaching, or the ethics in any profession, I'm concerned about what you do, what we do on a day-to-day basis, right? The second, when I talk about the ethics of, is really whether we ought to be doing certain things at all. And I hope that becomes clearer as we move forward. But since I learned a long time ago, there's nothing more useless than the answer to an unasked question. I want to kind of start with asking you three questions. Really, why are you here? You signed up for this webinar. What did you hope to get out of this in our time together today? And please, kind of, really would appreciate people throwing things into the Q&A chat, because I really would love to hear what your expectations were. The third is really question that's not there, but I'm curious for some of you, that really what are your kind of fundamental ethical challenges as a teacher? What do you struggle with most of all? So beginning with that, I want to kind of start off with really this kind of question the answer to which may seem obvious, but really, what is ethics? Right? And there are many answers, right? It's what is right and wrong. What are the bases or principles for deciding what's right and wrong? The process, that we're confronted with a reality, we're confronted with a situation. How do we decide what the right thing or the wrong thing is in that situation? And finally, again, kind of different way of talking about it is the process. One is the process which we use, but how do we even kind of think about what that type of process is or should be? Now, in our work together, and I'm interested in my work and my engagement with students and organizations, with really what I call practical ethics. That is, I'm not solely interested in somebody getting the right answer. What I'm really interested and concerned about is someone doing the right thing. Right? Now, you can't do the right thing if you haven't decided on the right thing. So practical ethics really is a rational, and when I say rational, I mean kind of a thoughtful and reflective decision about right conduct and the ability to defend your decisions. It's how do you answer the question, or struggle to answer the questions, how should I act now? And why should I act that way? Right? Can we give reasons? Can we give publicly available reasons for why this way of acting at this moment, in this situation, in responding to this ethical challenge is an acceptable answer? Right? And the why component becomes very, very important for many, many reasons, as I hope will become clear as we move forward. Now, those of us in a profession, and teaching is most definitely a profession, also have a kind of very even narrower, kind of more specific type of ethical obligations, and that's what we do call professional ethics. Professional ethics are those kind of what I call standards, norms, rules, principles, even duties that an organized group working in the same occupation has developed and holds to be the ideal, the best way, the right way to practice that occupation, to practice that profession. Now, professional ethics typically incorporate the broader social norms of ethics, what's acceptable, unacceptable, what's right, what's wrong, but invariably they include specific duties, or they kind of heighten certain duties that those outside the profession don't have, right? The easiest, kind of most readily accessible example perhaps is that we all may have a duty of keeping secrets, of maintaining confidentiality, probably a better phrase. But lawyers, as we all know, have a much kind of higher standard of confidentiality vis-a-vis their clients than most of us do in our kind of regular engagements. And we can all think of what certain issues are higher for particular professions, right? And as teachers, we have those as well, right? And we struggle sometimes when there's tensions between these kinds of different duties that we may be kind of engaging with as on our day-to-day work. So I want to start off by kind of making a hard claim, and that ethics always involves four things. First of all, a relationship. If you don't have a relationship, you don't have to have an ethics, right? Now, most of us typically think about that relationship as one with other human beings, right? And it's a perfectly appropriate issue. But that relationship could be very, very different, or it could be bigger or broader. Often when I have colleagues who kind of talk about ethics involving a relationship, they often reference the book Robinson Crusoe, and they say, well, Robinson Crusoe didn't need an ethics until he encounters Friday on the island, right? Now, I restrain myself and don't say anything, but really it either tells me that they haven't read the book or haven't read it recently, because one of Robinson Crusoe's biggest concerns early on is that he's forgotten what day of the week it is. And he's afraid that he's working on the Sabbath, right? So he understands his duties, his kind of ethical relationship as being one with the divine. You may think your ethical relationship is all sentient beings. You may think it's the one with the earth, or it may be all of them, right? We have multiple relationships. And we're also talking about values, duties, principles, norms. I really don't care what language we use there. I'm increasingly going to the kind of language of duties or obligations because it's more direct and I think it hits people a little bit differently, right? To ask the question, to whom or to what do I owe a duty or an obligation in this situation, is a somewhat more concrete question than to ask, what values or norms or principles are at risk in this situation. And then, as I said, you have to do something, right? This is about acting. It's about doing. And what are you supposed to do, right? How do you serve the duty you ought to serve in this situation? And then finally, and one I think that's easy to forget is the question of kind of publicness, right? That as I say, would a relatively disinterested third party find your action in this situation acceptable? That is, can you make the case for why this is an appropriate way of behaving, right? So those things are going on there in all kinds of ways, and I think it's really, really significant that we have to kind of think about this as we move forward. Now, we also have to recognize that most of us are making decisions with relatively limited information in real time, with relative ignorance of all possible outcomes and consequences. Right? So our decisions themselves are challenging. Right? Decisions themselves present us with complexity in our attempt to kind of come to both the right decision and figure out the right action, right? So we're struggling, right? And part of the challenge, or part of the things I want to invite us to think about as we move forward, is, do we think about, can we get the information we need? Am I as constrained in time as I think I am in having to make this decision, right? When it's a bigger decision, have we kind of taken the time to kind of play out the greatest possible, what the possible outcomes or consequences might be? Now, how do we know what to do? Right? This is about improving ethical decision making. And some of you may be familiar with Doonesbury. Uncle Duke, or character Duke, has become governor of American Samoa in this comic, and basically it becomes this question of, Duke's decision is, hey, any action that has good consequences is completely fine. Right? Zonker, his cousin, kind of becomes, throughout much of these comics, Duke's kind of conscience is outraged by this. Right? But you stop and think about it, many times we are consequentialists. And I'm sure all of you, or many of you, are very familiar with the trolley car problem, right? The problem basically is set out that you're walking along the railroad track, some kind of psychopathic philosophy professor has tied 5 people to the track, and a runaway trolley car is hurtling towards them, and they're going to soon, unfortunately, meet their demise, right? The positive thing about this is that there's a switching lever, and you can switch the car onto that track. However, there's one person tied to that track, and the question always is do you switch or not switch, right? And it's a closed universe. That's all the information you have. Whenever I used to give this to students before it became so common, everybody's trying to find a way out of it, because it puts you in moral distress. but typically when you ask this question to an audience, 86% is kind of the normal distribution, will pull the switch, right? And when you ask them why, they basically do a kind of moral calculus. They total up the number of goods produced, 5, subtract the number of bads produced, 1, getting a net gain of goods of 4, and they make that decision. However, if I switch the facts around, and instead of pulling a switch, you have to push someone in front of the trolley car, the moral calculus is the same. 5 minus 1 is still 4. Out of that 86%, if I were to ask them this question, 86% of them would not push the guy. Now, there are lots of kind of complex reasons about that, and we could talk about that as well. But I use this to kind of illustrate the fact that when we come to ethical challenges, when we come to ethical problems, most of us don't come with a tool. Most of us don't come with a single way of thinking through them. Most of us don't come with a value. We come with tools, we come with values, we come with norms. And sometimes we're going to be consequentialists, as we were in the first slide. And other times, most of us are not going to be consequentialists, as happened in the second in this slide, right? So what toolbox, what tools ought we to apply to a particular situation, right? And that's really part of the complexity of dealing with ethical issues is knowing what tool, if I may, ought to be applied given the specificity of the problem. Now, the other thing that I want to make clear is that true ethical dilemmas involve choosing between and among competing values and duties. They're not between good and bad, typically, but between good and another good, or more precisely in this situation, between a perceived good, right? On one hand, he's a cheater. On the other hand, he's a star of our team. This is what is known as a moral dilemma, right? The perceived good is winning. The good is the kind of fairness of the team, right? So this challenge of us as individuals that we have to kind of figure out, which of these goods, that was what makes it challenging, is which of these goods ought we to serve in this situation. And then the interesting question about if the ideal ways to practice are determined by those in a profession, what are the guardrails, right? How do we know that those in the profession will not just jointly choose the easiest ways, right? It's a great question. Typically, my feeling is the question isn't that, or the issue isn't that, because no profession is going to kind of basically list values or norms that put them in a bad light. The issue, for me at least, is mostly about a situation where they use one of the kind of express values or norms to really undermine the mission of the profession, right? We can think about this in the recent news with the Panama Papers situation and lawyers, right? To what extent do lawyers occasionally use the kind of duty of confidentiality to actually help people mask bad behavior, right? So there's this tendency sometimes to kind of use one of the norms of our profession in a way that protects us and our ability, protects us and our kind of ability to do something because it's good for us, rather than using the norm to really, it's kind of a way of kind of serving the fundamental principle, goals, or values of the profession, right? And that's a challenge, right? And sometimes our values in our organization, if our organization has a kind of statement of values or principles, have to be understood to work together. So I do one with a local organization, and one of the values is courage, and one of the values is integrity or whatever. And I say, if you don't put them together, yeah, I could be courageously immoral, right? There's a consistency there, and there needs to be, right? But at the same time, there are ways and moments where some professions actually do manipulate, maybe too strong a word, but I'm in a cranky mood today, so I'm going to stay with it. Their own kind of statement of values in order to serve their purposes. And so, for example, to stay with the legal profession, one of the reasons, in fact, the primary reason that lawyers can kind of break confidentiality is to make sure that they get paid, right? Clearly self-serving. Not saying it's illegitimate, but it's an example of kind of how people may kind of create a kind of escape from their values and norms in order to really serve themselves, right? And we have to think about that. Now, I don't want to go afield, but since this question came up, I do want us to think about the fact that having a profession and being a professional is to some extent a societal grant, or as I say it's a social wager, that historically societies have kind of granted professions certain privileges with the assumption that whatever the cost to society is for them to kind of have those privileges is going to be less than the benefits the society gets, right? So societies will get more benefits by granting professions privileges than they lose. So one of the challenges we all have as professionals is to make sure, or to ensure that we're living up to our part of that kind of wager, to the part of that kind of contract, right? So it's important, right? And I think there's a kind of mutuality that we need to be aware of and need to consider as we move forward with that. But a great question, and something that's there. Mike, anything in particular? Anything's come up that I really need to kind of deal with as we've been going through?
Yeah, I believe we're fine. Thank you for answering Cindy's question. And again, I encourage everyone. I see the audience chat is moving along pretty quickly.
Yeah.
So if you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the managed Q&A. Otherwise, we're fine, Dr. Queen. Thank you so much.
Right, and so Ms. Chow Nagatsuka, the question about when they don't align with others, right? And I hope to kind of deal with this a little later, but remember, that in many situations there may be multiple acceptable answers. Right? There are going to be a lot of wrong and downright bad answers. That there could be acceptable answers, right? And so there may be situations where a completely acceptable answer isn't what you would have chosen. But it's not wrong, it's not bad. Maybe one I disagree with, it's not one I would have done, but there's sound reasons for having gone that, right? So that's a different issue than than something that's wrong, right? And that becomes part of the challenge, right? And that often happens in situations where what I call situations that aren't really what I would call ethical problems, but often are kind of policy problems with ethical dimensions, right? So again, the easiest one, just because it's an easy example for people to grasp with, and it's easy to articulate, is that from whom does a nonprofit take money, right? That's not an ethical question. As long as the money's legally obtained, it's not an ethical question. It's a policy question that has an ethical dimension, right? You may believe that the only thing wrong with tainted money is they're tainted enough. You also may be very, very rigid about from whom you take money, right? There's no quote unquote right answer. There's no wrong answer, but there's going to be consequences for any answer. As long as it doesn't distort your decision making, it's a policy question. And there are going to be ethical issues folded into it, but it's a policy question, right? And so often what we tend to kind of disagree with or kind of have problems with is when we kind of have a difficulty separating out truly ethical questions from other types of questions that have ethical dimensions, right? So first of all, it's important to kind of see that good ethics and ethics, and I'm really concerned about what you do, is first about good decision making. Bad ethical decisions typically result when we act when we don't have enough information. We tend to ignore certain facts that there may be inconvenient to us, or particular tendency that's common among administrators, a tendency towards willful ignorance. I don't want to know things that I probably ought to know because then it's going to make me make a difficult decision. We haven't interpreted the facts well, if at all. We often, kind of our personal experiences with the individuals involved are going to kind of lead us towards deferring to one person's interpretation of the events than the others, and maybe in that instance, we were wrong, right? Often we kind of also get sucked into, I'll flip the order here, but also we often get sucked into kind of focusing on things that aren't relevant to the ethical decision, right? And again, I mean, all of you have probably been in meetings where everybody's talking about something that's not at all key to really what the issue is. Either because they want to avoid dealing with the issue, often because there's something in the issue that, and believe it or not, this is a technical term, has a high yuck factor, and they can't get past it. Or there's some bright, shiny thing that's kind of distracting people, right? And kind of example, several years ago, his colleagues and I had a grant from the National Science Foundation to see whether problem-based learning kind of helped students in professional programs make better ethical decisions. We had 7 different fields from 4 universities across Atlanta, and the first problem, believe it or not, was should people be allowed to clone Neanderthals? You may think that's a bizarre problem, but the person who's actually mapped the Neanderthal genome thinks that actually you could clone a Neanderthal in within 5 years if you were committed to it. Well, they're discussing this, but all of a sudden, the students in my problem-based learning group got completely stuck on where you would implant the embryo. Right? Plant it in a human, female human, because there'd be structural and kind of biological problems about delivery, and you plant it in a great ape. And they got stuck on this issue for 3.5 hours. Maybe an interesting issue, completely irrelevant to the ethical decision. I would argue the ethical decision only hinges on one fact. Is this a human? If so, you can't experiment on it. Therefore, the decision is over. Right? So we can get stuck on things that kind of completely take us away from really what the core thing is. We can focus on ethically irrelevant issues, or we can fail to kind of grapple with what is really relevant to the decision making, right? And again, for years, I used to judge the Intercollegiate Ethics Bowl competition. Yes, it is as cool and groovy as it sounds. And there was a case the students had, and they really got so focused on the bright, shiny things in the case, mostly having to do with sex, that they completely missed the core fact that myself and the other judges felt was essential to the decision making, was really kind of the age of the individuals involved, right? So we can kind of get too focused on insignificant issues, or ignore things that are really key to making a good decision there. The other one is the one that's always there, is really kind of, have we ordered the values or duties that ought to be served appropriately, right? Are we really serving the duty that ought to be served in this situation or not? But really, what I want people to think about is not just coming to the right decision, but what do you do, right? And one of the hardest things about the what do you do part, and the research bears this out, particularly with individuals just entering the workforce, but I think it happens to all of us, is that often, even when we do recognize an ethical problem, even if we do recognize what the duty is right there, we get frozen about acting because we feel torn between doing nothing and going nuclear. And what I want to say is that the how you do what you need to do is a separate conversation in your head or among whoever's involved from what you ought to do, right? Can you serve the duty you need to serve here? Or how do you serve the duty you need to serve here? And simultaneously produce the fewest number of negative consequences, right? What is the response here that makes sure I serve this duty, but doesn't cause unnecessary problems across the board, right? So the how and the what are separate conversations, and we need to kind of treat them as separate and significant, right? So And I'll give you an example. Right after I took this job about 21 years ago, I get a call from a student who'd been in my program before I was here, and he had an ethical issue. Right now, I learned a long time ago. Most of the time, when I get calls about ethical issues, people already know what they're supposed to do. They just want me to validate their easy way of getting out of it. This wasn't him, but he basically had a job he really loved, recently married, 3-month-old child, but basically discovered that his boss was, for all intents and purposes, a thief, and he wanted to know what to do. Right? And I said, well, you have to leave, but that doesn't mean you have to storm into the office today and jump up and down and create a scene, right? So give yourself a timeline. I will be out of here in 6 months, whatever. Because if you don't give yourself a timeline, you're going to just let it linger. Start economizing. Polish up your resume. Start looking for a job. Start collecting evidence on your boss's bad behavior, right? And then act, at the appropriate time, right? Whatever your timeline is. Now, if what his boss had been doing had been endangering people, my advice would have been completely different, right? The facts would have changed my answer, right? But there's this issue of kind of the how and moving forward. So the issue of any ethical decision involves context, role, our analysis, the duties, the ordering of them, and the application of them, and our action, right? What do you do and how do we do it, right? How do I serve the duty? How do I meet my duty in this situation in a way that minimizes the number of negative consequences? So where do they come from, right? Well, they come from lots of places, right? Most of us don't get to make them up, right? And I think that's where we tend to kind of forget what's going on, right? So we have the law, code of ethics statements of our profession, of our organization, our professional obligations as norms, generally accepted ethical moral norms. All of those are there. They're given to us, right? Most of the time, we don't have to think about where the values come from. They're given to us. And most of the time, since most of us don't live at the tail end of the bell curve, we don't have to think about when and under what conditions do we actually have to violate the norms in order to serve something higher. Sometimes it happens. But for most of our lives, most of the time, we live in a situation where having to kind of violate some kind of law or some kind of normative reality in order to serve a greater good isn't there, right? But it does happen, and I acknowledge that. And this is what they do. They're codes of conduct, rules and regulations, values, duties, etc., right? But how do we think about them as we think about teaching? Right? What are the issues that we kind of engage with as teachers, right? So how is it an ethical calling? What does it mean to be a teacher? What obligations, what duties do we assume when we accept the role of teacher? To students, to our institution, to the profession, to wider society, right? Because we have all of these duties. And I think one way of thinking about it, or one way of kind of beginning to kind of think into it, is really to kind of ask the question, what's the purpose of education, right? And if we step back, really teaching is fundamentally about developing and forming individuals, right? It's not solely about imparting information. And if that's the case, then maybe it kind of reframes our understanding of kind of the role that ethics plays, both in the way we kind of comport ourselves and the way we act, but also in kind of how we undertake the actions and undertake the duties we take, right? Right, and so there's all things about this, right? I mean, education serves all kinds of things, right? It serves a kind of ability for people to kind of get on in lives, right? To actually make a living, right? It serves as an opportunity for people to kind of reflect on what makes a truly good life. There's all kinds of things that education serves, and if it doesn't happen well, bad things happen. But there's always the kind of issue of what I call the ethics in and the ethics of. And most of us, especially in our jobs, are really mostly about the ethics in. It's how I comport myself day to day as a teacher. Am I behaving ethically? But there's always going to be the ethics of, right? It's about the approach to the role. It's to the issues that surround the act of teaching, right? It's easier to make really kind of good examples about that when I talk to the corporate world, right? Because I can talk about people who may be working in a PR firm, and you may be approached by somebody who's a murderous dictator and say, hey, I want you to clean up my reputation. Now, the way you did that work could be ethical. That would be the ethics in, right? But the ethics of is really about, should I be doing this thing at all, right? So ethics in is what we do in the course of our day-to-day work. Ethics of is, ought we to be doing this individual, this particular thing at all? So what is this, right? So kind of model rules for educators, and I don't know what different kind of statements your particular areas have, what your union is, but this is kind of the model rules, right? And it's like most, they're explained in all of these down the line, and you all have the reading, right? Right. But like most of these, they've always got this bad part, right? They kind of start with the duties, which I think are great: responsibility for vision, responsibility for professional competence, responsibility to students, to the community, and then everybody has to kind of go off the rails with some sort of compliance statement, right? Responsible and ethical use of technology, right? No, that's something gets embedded somewhere else. But what I find kind of questionable about this one is that it actually leaves out what many of you actually put into the chat, is what's your responsibility to society, right? Right. We've got these duties to the profession. What does it mean to be a teacher? Professional competence, which my feeling is kind of gets embedded in that, but your duties to be able to do what you do to your students, to the community, and to society, right? The NEA, the Code of Ethics for Educators, starts off with this kind of preamble, right? The worth and dignity of each human being, right? Importance of pursuit of truth, devotion to excellence, and the nurture of democratic principles, right? And then what we do, right? But I like the really kind of first line in that second paragraph: the magnitude of the responsibility inherent in the teaching process, right? That's what happens, right? And therefore, as it goes on in the second sentence, right, there's an incentive to attain and maintain the highest possible degree of ethical conduct, right? And it's aspirational, right? This is how we ought to be, right? Now, one of the challenges is that true ethical dilemmas involve choosing between and among competing values and duties. Right? It's not between good and bad, but between good and another good, or a perceived good. Right? And that's what makes these challenges particularly difficult, is because basically we're going to sacrifice or give up one good in order to kind of serve the duty that ought to be served, right? That's why it's not easy, right? I may have to report bad behavior of a superior, right? Well, that may have a really negative consequence for me. My good of self-interest, my good of maintaining my livelihood. How do I negotiate those duties, or how do I come to grips with the fact that even though it may have a cost for me, that this is what I need to do, right? And that's really where we kind of start struggling, right? Is when it becomes hard, right? When we have to kind of negotiate these different kind of competing goods. Lauren's comment, being ethical can be inconvenient. Yeah, it can. I actually, before I was here this evening, I was giving a ethics piece for Ethics and Integrity Day for the new leadership DeKalb County, Georgia class, which actually, unlike most leadership kind of organizations, is actually not junior people. These are actually very senior people. And I actually entitled that talk, Ethics Isn't for Wimps. Right? Because if this were easy, we wouldn't be having to have these conversations. Right? If doing the right thing was easy, then this would not be a necessary conversation. But the challenge is that it's not easy. Right? It's hard. Right? Right? And there are consequences, right? And Jacqueline's kind of comment about when you do what you ought to do the right thing, and there are negative consequences for it. What does that do? How does that teach us to be, quote unquote, unethical, right? Or not to kind of put ourselves out. And this is the challenge, right? And I think the issue that many of us finding ourselves, we're embedded in systems, and we're often in systems that we don't control, right? And the challenge with being in systems we don't control is that people in those systems, or maybe running those systems, aren't always concerned about what we ought to be concerned about and what should be concerned about as kind of part of an educational system, right? They're not always concerned about the good of the students. They may be concerned about, if you live in a place where superintendents are elected, they may be much more concerned about getting elected than they are about doing the right thing. People may be much more concerned about maintaining their reputation than they are about doing the right thing, right? And so we kind of find ourselves challenged because we are embedded in systems that aren't always serving the duties that we're committed to serving, right? And our question then becomes is how do we manage ethical behavior in those systems, right? And I'm sure that many of you are kind of struggling in certain political environments with that right now, right? My brother, as I said, was an elementary school principal and basically retired in the middle of the term last year because he fundamentally could no longer, in good conscience, do what he was committed to doing as a principal. As he said, my goal is to serve my students and my teachers, my staff, and the environment in which I'm operating no longer enables me to do that, right? Now, my brother had enough years in, it was possible for him to be able to make that decision, not easily, because he loved what he was doing. But sometimes we find ourselves, right? And he had kind of done everything he could to kind of protect his teachers that way, right? And without running the risk of kind of giving away where he was, when the semester started, he basically was given a rule that said if any of the teachers in classes had reading lists, that the list actually had to be approved by the central administration. And my brother, being my brother, said, okay, to his teachers, bring in any book you want to bring, just don't create a list. Right? Then the next rule was that no, he basically had to go through every single classroom in his school and make sure that every book in that in every classroom was approved, right? It had been approved by the central administration, and my brother basically said, "I'm not going to do that to my teachers. That's not my that's wrong." Right? So we get stuck in systems, and we have to kind of think about what's going on in these systems, and can we act within them? Can we kind of create our own kind of ethical wall around ourselves and our job where we can kind of protect ourselves from what goes on badly? Then sometimes that's a possibility. But these individual challenges are always there, right? And we're struggling, right? When do I give up doing something that I tremendously value and I can still produce something really, really good because the external environment around me is so onerous that it's no longer possible, right? When does that line get drawn? And when does that line get drawn for all of us, right? It's a real significant challenge, right? So this is what's going on, right? And I think as we kind of think through our ethical decision making, and I'm going to have to make a really disturbing confession that I actually sent the wrong slide deck in, or at least parts of the wrong slide deck. So there are things that are here that I hadn't anticipated being here, but we're going to go with it. I don't know how that happened. So if you've been bored with what I've done, tell me. The slide deck that I was really going to send you was incredible. But on this slide, I really want to kind of focus on the last bullet point. Is teaching is relational, contextual, and part of a system. And indeed, it's part of multiple systems, right? And our ability to kind of think through working in these systems and how do we kind of maintain our ethical abilities and our ethical actions within those systems is important, right? Because we may be handcuffed in certain ways. We may be challenged because other people in the kind of system in which we're operating don't, as I suggested earlier, have the kind of commitments and values that we have, right? And our decision making and our actions are really kind of complicated by the nature of that system, right? And if we think through it, right, we're dealing with lots of different things all the time, right? Our day-to-day work, we have even the kind of material we select. Is the material kind of really serving our students, right? What happens, as many of us have kind of really have been faced to think, are we being forced to teach to tests, right? And therefore, our kind of ability and our expectations and our ability to really serve the students because is constrained because we have to make sure, or at least are under pressure to make sure, that the students are doing well on these tests. But that may not necessarily, on other ways, be kind of serving them particularly well, right? We're constrained. What do we do within that system, right? Our preparation, right? I mean, again, the time demands on all of you all as teachers are unconscionable, right? The system itself is unethical by what it expects from you, right? And yet, it's the system in which you have to operate, right? What do? How do we manage that? How do we think through it? What do we do, and what are our abilities to do things that kind of shift and change the system, right? While at the same time trying to do our work as well as we can, right? And what's the act and the art of teaching? And then many of you kind of mentioned in the slides about basically this kind of process of being constantly observed, on my language, not yours, right? And yet, we're human beings, right? And we're always there, right? What are we modeling on our day-to-day basis about ethics, right? Especially when we often may feel that we're under a microscope, right? And the burden that puts on us, right? Right, as Jason said, right, back to kind of the issue, right? There's, we have lots of students, right? But yet, they often tend to be in a situation where everything gets treated the same way, right? Very little opportunities for kind of responsiveness to the specificity of a student or the specificity of a particular situation. All of that's going on all the time, right? Right? How do you kind of handle it? Right? How do you kind of handle it when you may be getting punished for doing the right thing? Right? When some of you may remember several years ago, Atlanta public school system had a kind of major cheating scandal, right? And I was in the news a lot, kind of addressing the ethical issues of the cheating scandal. And among the things I did, I wrote an incredibly vicious editorial for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, really blaming the place where it needed to be blamed, which was senior administration. But I'm a nice guy, though sometimes that's hard for people to realize. So I contact the public schools and say, hey, this is coming out tomorrow. I want to help. Okay. I get a call. I say, great. Well, we want you to help. You're on the ethics committee, the special ethics committee for Atlanta Public Schools. All right. Well, the day I went to the first meeting, there'd been a story on CNN about one of the teachers who actually hadn't changed the grades on the standard tests. And I went into this meeting and I said, you know, here is somebody that was trying to do the right thing, but for years, 5, 6, 7 years, she's struggling because all of her colleagues in the same grade, their students are performing better and better than her students are. She's kind of stressing. She's kind of questioning her ability as a teacher. But she'd been doing the right thing. Everybody else was cheating. And I told the chief of staff of the acting superintendent, you all missed a major opportunity. If the superintendent had called that woman and said, we're sorry. We're sorry you suffered. You're exactly the kind of teacher we want in this system. And yes, it was rough, but this is exactly what we want to be. And kind of held that up and kind of pointed out that we actually reward and honor people that do the right thing. Think about how transformative that would have been, right? You know, but what happens when you're not rewarded for doing the right thing? When in fact you're punished for doing the right thing? Or when they're constantly changing the rules on you so you don't even know what the right thing is, right? You've done as best you can under the old rules, and the next thing you know, you're getting challenged by what's going on, right? Because that's what's going on, right? And again, the tension, right, as Jason says, right, that, you know, teaching to the test and only kind of having this kind of formalized assessment is there. And at the same time, when you may have people pushing to teach the test, but if you don't have assessment, you may have administrators basically pushing you to graduate people no matter what happens, right? Really? This is wrong, right? And that's it, right? And we feel that differently because we are actually involved in the lives of our students. We're involved in the lives of our students on a day-to-day basis. And to some extent, we're meddling in those lives, right? What we do for our students and what we do in engaging with them has consequences. And we're doing that when we do it at our best in a situation that kind of fundamentally serves what the purpose of education is that basically education is a normative act. It's inherently an ethical act. Our goal as teachers always is to get our students better, if not good, at something. To get them better at the subject we're teaching, but we want our students, no matter where we are, to have more than just technical proficiency. We want them to use that knowledge that they have in appropriate ways. None of us would care how technically proficient our surgeon is if our surgeon had us under anesthesia on the operating table and said to herself, "This person has 5 perfectly good organs. I can take them and give them to 5 other people and save their lives." No. To be good at something is more than just technical proficiency. We want our students to be able to participate productively and valuably in society, and ideally to use the information we hope that they're gaining from our time with us for the good. Everything we do is about forming students. Everything we do is about moving them from one place to someplace better. And often we have to do that against all kinds of pressures, against all kinds of struggles, against constraints of resources, against constraints of people who have goals other than the good of our students. And we struggle. But if we struggle well, back to what Thomas More says, who will know? You, your pupils, your friends, and what other kind of higher element you feel you're serving in your day-to-day work. So kind of in my presentation there, and really kind of finish with any kind of ongoing questions, thoughts, concerns people may have. So thank you all for your time. Thank you for everything you've done. Thank you for dealing with my screw up with the wrong slides. But I hope despite that, the time you found here this evening had some value. So thank you all very much.
No worries, and thank you so much, Dr. Queen. You see the thanks throughout the chat, and I find myself just hanging on every word as with members of the audience tonight. I think we have a lot of webinars, and I'm always just so encouraged when I see the conversation in the audience chat. And tonight there was so much sharing, there was so much community building, and there were several notes that I took. But when you mentioned we want them to have more than technical proficiency, to be good at something is more than mere technical proficiency. We want them to participate productively, to be of value in society. And and pardon me, you all, if I didn't get their names down, but I noted we must take a holistic approach to teaching. And June, about 10 minutes ago, said we are tasked with teaching skills. We're not tasked with teaching them to be what we think are good humans. Yes, critical thinking skills, teaching them how to think, but not what to think, a challenge. And so for that very reason, I hope that you all continue these conversations. And I hope that you all are able to connect. If I'm able to facilitate that connection, please do not hesitate to reach out to us. Again, Dr. Queen, we appreciate you. Um, in so many ways, I, like the teachers, it was validating, it was affirming, and it was encouraging. And we're fortunate to have you tonight. And so, again, we wholeheartedly thank you. We thank your teachers who are here as well. Thanks for joining tonight's session. And I encourage you, if you're able to connect with Dr. Queen to follow his work, please do so. Several of you, when you logged in tonight, I can tell that you were familiar with his work by your responses and your hellos and your thanks. So again, we absolutely appreciate you. We'll move on. We have a few minutes left here. And so I'll let you all know that, again, follow us on our social media channels at National Humanities Center, NHC Education as well. And also, I encourage you to support the work, support the humanities education programs. The NHC education programs provide a bridge between the academic world and the working classroom. Your gift, no matter how modest, can open up a world of ideas for teaching and rekindle their enthusiasm, our teachers' enthusiasm for the subjects they teach by providing the knowledge and the tools that they and their students need to make a difference. And next up, so September 24th, creating culturally responsive classrooms and equity mindsets. Leslie Nicole Clement, who is the director of the University Honors Program at Johnson C. Smith University, which is located here in Charlotte, North Carolina, HBCU in Charlotte, North Carolina. But she will be on September the 24th at 7 o'clock Eastern Time. So join us here. Again, I see that many of you have already signed up tonight. We were upwards of 700 plus attendees. And so we're just truly excited to have you here. And again, we encourage you to follow all that's happening at the National Humanities Center. If I can ever be of assistance, please do not hesitate to reach out. Dr. Queen, I see your message in the chat, and he indicated please do reach out. Please contact him if you should have any questions whatsoever. And thank you all. We wish you all well, and we will see you all back here very, very, very soon. All right? Take care.
Thank you all. Be well.
Thank you again, sir.